Let's talk about smart impact analysis and reducing the scope of testing. So what impedes the delivery of innovative software? We know that testing is the #1 barrier to speed and agility. So when we're making those changes to our systems, we want to get them out to the users as quickly as possible and with as much quality as possible. But we have to go out and test those changes. So how do we determine what to go out and test when we're making changes to our SAP landscape? We know we could go out and try and test everything. So we could test all of our used transactions and programs that are on our system, but that takes a lot of time. So if you use an application like Change Impact Analysis by LiveCompare, we're able to help you identify where those impacts are when you're loading those transports onto your systems, helping you understand what exactly needs to be tested. So what the change impact analysis is great at doing is getting you down to this most at risk set of executables that covers 100% of the changes that are coming through on your transports. So would you rather test everything or test the most at risk set of executables? So let's take a look at what the process is. If we take a look, we're starting with our development box here. We're getting ready to make our changes to our SAP system via the SAP transport capability. We need to determine what are those most at risk capabilities so we know exactly what to go out and test. And then we also need to figure out what test assets we have to cover those most at risk executables. LiveCompare can help you do that by scanning your test repository. So after we identify the most at risk within the Change Impact Analysis app, we'll also scan your test repository to determine what test assets you have to cover those changing objects. We'll also include your usage data because we know that's important when we start thinking about upgrades from SAP, support packs. We want to make sure that all of the changes that we're analyzing apply to the customer's particular SAP landscape. So how do we do that? Well, we take a look at creating a cache of the customer's SAP system. And that cache looks a lot like this dependency chain here. But we go through and we look at all of the executables and all of the objects on the SAP system and create a huge map of the links in your SAP system so that when we make those changes on the transports, we know what those objects are being used by. So in this case, we have an include down here at the bottom that's being changed by a transport. And you can see the dependency chain to get down to that changing object. When we think about most at risk, how do we determine what those most at risk objects are? Well, one of the things that we look at is this dependency chain. So we take these executables that we're using on our system and we say for VA01, we have to go through 4 levels to get down to that changing object from the transport. For VA03, we have to go down 5 levels to get to that changing object that's on our transport. But if we look at VA02, it's a direct call into that include. So in this case, the best executable to test that changing include would be VA02. And that's what we would put on our most at risk set of objects to go out and test. So there's a few different factors actually to go into our most at risk, and they are business critical. So if you have a customer that has some critical transactions or programs, executables in their system that they wouldn't want to go live without testing if they had been impacted, we'll take that list and we'll always put them on the most at risk if they're impacted at all. And then the second thing that we look at is the dependency chain, and that's what you're seeing here. The third thing that we look at is the usage data, and that usage data comes right from the production SAP system so that we know exactly what you're using. So what can be impacted? What kind of executables are out there? We know there's a huge surface area within SAP of things that need to be tested, starting from the data dictionary and going all the way out from your standard and custom code. There's lots of different things that need to be tested: transactions, programs, Fiori apps, your APIs, interfaces, and your users or roles. So that makes up our testable surface area. So when we run that change impact analysis app, we find the most at risk, but then the next thing that we do is scan the test repository. And we can scan lots of different test repositories, starting with Tosca and Qtest. We also scan ALM, Certify, or ADO. So as we scan that test repository, we take those most at risk executables and we say, what test assets do I have to cover this set of executables right here? So in light blue, you see the coverage. In dark blue, you see the gaps, and those gaps are very important because for this particular release that we're looking at on our system, we need to know what test assets we don't have so that we have 100% coverage of everything that's changing. So what this allows you to do is build up your test automation or your testing assets so that eventually you get to having no gaps in your system so that you have test assets for everything. So looking at those gaps and creating those assets become much easier. Let's think about test data analysis for a second. So how do we pick the right test? Well, in Tosca, when you think about going out and recording the modules for all of the tests that you're creating in automation, we go out and record all the steps that it takes to run those transactions or run those programs within your SAP system. If there's a data change within SAP, it comes through on a table, like this table up here, the TVAK table. And in this case, you can see there's a change here for this particular order type. And this order type TA is what we're going to scan your tests for in this case. So if it's a table key that's changing, we can scan the test case within Tosca to identify the right test. That really helps us run fewer tests. It's more accurate testing, and we get maximum risk coverage. So let's just review. We start off in our development system with an application change on our SAP system. We use the change impact analysis to determine what can be tested. And then we use our testing repository to test those changes. We then can use the test audit app within LiveCompare to go out and identify if the tests have actually been run and if they were successful or not. We can also use the release assurance app to be able to help us understand for the transports that are going through our system, have we included all of the right SAP objects in that transport so that we can go into production with 0 defects. Let's take a look at running the Smart Impact app. In our group of apps here, these are the ones pertaining to the testing filter. We have other filters along the side here for development, InfoSec, and operations. But for this example, we're just taking a look at the Smart Impact in the testing area. So if we click on the Smart Impact app, let's take a look at the information needed to run our analysis when we're introducing change to our SAP system in our development box. If we create a variant, the inputs you can see here, we can run it against transports. So these would be your custom development transports, maybe that you run weekly, monthly. It could also be a group of objects. Maybe a developer is putting in an object and wants to know how that object is going to be impacted. You could also use charm change requests. So the analysis system is going to be your development box, and it's for us in this example here, it's going to be where these 5 transports reside. If I was using a change request from Charm, I would put in my solution manager system, and then my performance history system is going to be my production SAP instance. This is where I'm grabbing all of my usage data so that LiveCompare knows exactly what is being executed on the SAP box, what users, what application stats, etc. So
We can click on the compare changing objects so that we can see the side-by-side comparison of the objects that are on the transports, and then we'll give it a comparison system. So this comparison system would be either your QA box or your production box, because you're going to be comparing it back to the analysis system up here, which would be development. Then we're going to give it a test repository. So when you run this analysis, to find your most at risk executables, you also want to find the test cases that you have that you can use to test those changes. So choose a test repository. It can be Tosca, it can be Qtest, it could be Certify, ALM, or Azure DevOps. And then you can drill down into the search path here for the tests, and then you can also create a test execution and give that a name. Then we can run it from here. So if I go back to my variant, we can take a look at the results over on the right-hand side. So I'll click right here to open up the results of running my large change smart impact analysis. The first dashboard that pops up is the heat map. And this heat map is really meant to focus your eyes in on the most at risk. As you can see at the key across the top, there's objects that are not impacted by the changes that we're making. There's gray objects that are impacted. And then there's the most at risk that are in the bright blue color. On this particular heat map or tree map, size does matter. So the bigger the box, the more usage data behind it. So some are going to be a little bit bigger than others, but it's meant to focus your eyes in on what's most important in this particular change event. Then we'll come down here to our Smart Impact Analysis details and open that up. So this dashboard jumps right into those 3 pillars that we've been talking about. So we have our used, all of the usage data from our production instance, both standard and custom. And then the ones that are impacted from that group of 5 transports that we were looking at in this example. So how many of those transactions or programs or iDocs, et cetera, are going to be impacted? And then the most at risk right here. The most at risk is the perfect set of executables that cover 100% of the changing objects on the transport. So this is the least number of objects to go out and test to make sure that you're covering all the changes on those transports. And I really like the Excel spreadsheet here because it gives you the breakdown of all of those numbers and it gives you the savings. So you can see for our most at risk, we have 130 standard objects. We have 34 custom objects that need to be tested. And it was for a savings of 97%. So you can test everything right here. You can go out and try to test just what's impacted, or you can test the executables that are most at risk driven by LiveCompare. So when we run the app, it's also going to go out and search our test repository. So in this case, we gave it a Tosca repository and it found 43 hits and 121 gaps. So what that means is for 121 of the most at risk tokens, we need to have test cases created for them. There was nothing in our Tosca database that would match that token. Then as we go down on the screen, you can see the most at risk test coverage. So it breaks it out by object type. So in this case right here for the T codes, it looks like we have test coverage of 37 of those T codes, 0 of the roles, only 2 of the iDocs, 0 of the programs, 2 of the WAPAs or business server pages, and then 2 of the RFCs. And then as we go down a little bit further, the most at risk by application area just helps you identify where the majority of the change is going to take place. And it looks like in this particular release that we're looking at, it's a lot of customization that's going to be impacted. So as we go down here to the bottom and head over to the right, the next tab is the Help tab. This is a great place to go out and find definitions of all of the other things that we're going to be looking at in this report. So don't forget about the Help tab. The Home tab is really where all of the information starts. So it starts off on the left-hand side with the application area. Then the type and the name right here are the executables that are found on the SAP production instance that are going to be impacted. We've sorted this list by the most at risk because those are going to be the most important. But we give you all of the information. So you can see all three of the pillars represented here. There's the most at risk, there's the impacted, and the used. So if you were a QA person, you could hand them off this list and say, these are the most at risk executables. These are the ones that we need to focus our testing on. And then heading over to the right on the spreadsheet, the impactful objects give you more information about why we recommended that you test VA01. And we'll jump into that in just a moment. And then we'll also give you the test hits. So for each one of these objects, what were the tests that we found that would cover those tokens? We'll give you the usage from the production history data. We'll give you the users so that you can see who's using those transactions and who's going to be impacted by the changes. We'll also give you the top user so that if you have gaps, you know who to go to possibly help record the process or create the test script itself. So let's start back over here and jump into analyzing why VA01 was a most at risk transaction. The impactful objects right here, it looks like there were 11. If we double click there, it takes us out to give us more of the details. So it starts off with the change ID or the transport number, and then the child type and child name are the objects from the transports that are impacting this VA01. You can see it gives you the depth, and the depth is just the dependency chain and locating that executable. So this particular enhancement object was found at a depth of 2 away from the T code VA01. So VA01 uses a program which uses an enhancement object. So it's really about the dependency chain and how closely related this object is to VA01. So then over to the right, we'll give you the description. We'll give you the screen if we can tie it back to a screen. So the DINPRO is here. And if we click on that one in the DINPRO box, it takes us out to the screen that's impacted. And then I'm going to head back to my impactful objects. And then it will give you the usage. It'll give you the users. So you can click here and see all of the users that are using VA01. And then further over to the right, it gives you the test hits. So if I click here, the 4 tests that were found that cover this particular VA01 token, it'll give you the test ID, the test name, the test path. And then a little bit over to the right, it will give you whether or not the test case has data, and we'll talk more in depth about that. It'll give you the usage and the top user and their usage. So the has data column is referring to whether or not the test case could potentially have data to help you test the right change. So if you have tables that are being impacted, I've flipped over to the test data tab now down here at the bottom. If you have tables that are being impacted, you can use that data from the test case to drive to the right test case. So in this case, we have a table right here, TVAKT, and you can see what's different or what's changing between the systems is this description. So in order to test this, you really want to make sure that you're testing this particular key field right here. So this particular order type, we want to make sure that we're testing. So Tosca records the information when it goes through and you create your test case for VA01. It's recording those different types of sales orders. So if there is a test case that specifically looks at the sales order type, ZOR, we'll pull that test case forward and we'll put it in to your test hit details right here. And in this column right here for the has data, you'll see an indication that that particular test case has data in it that's going to help you test a specific change. So back to the impactful objects for VA01. So we have the test hits, and then just a little bit over to the right, we have the application area, the development class, whether or not it's custom, and the business critical. And remember, business critical is a way of allowing the customer to customize the most at risk. So if you have a customer that has transactions that they would never want to go live without testing if they were impacted, we would create a business critical input into the Smart Impact Analysis app. And every time that particular transaction or program or IDOC, etc., was impacted, we would put it on the most at risk list. So in this case, VA01 is a business critical object, and you are going to see it on the most at risk list. So we started over here with the home page, and we've gone through each one of these columns over here to the right. If we look down at the bottom, you can see the impactful objects, the impacted screens, the impacted users, and the role detail. We can see the test hits and gaps. So we'll map out for each one of those tokens, those most at-risk tokens, we'll map out the test coverage, whether it was a hit or a gap, and then give you the usage information on this tab. And then on the test hit details, you can see the test hit details for the specific executable that you're looking at, or you can come in here and select all of the test hit details and get a complete list of what your execution list should look like. So that's the Home tab and the subsequent tabs to the right. So great information giving you the most at-risk executables needed here. And then to finish it off, we'll take that information into Tosca or Qtest or some of the other test repositories and show you that data there. So let's jump over to the Tosca side. And I'll start with the test cases. I scanned my SAP test case library here, and it generated inputs in the requirements. So anything that I could not find a hit for, and remember there were a lot that we had gaps on. So now I have a requirement out here. I can start creating my test cases from here, and then it will also create an execution list. And so from the select execution list, you're up and running and ready to start running those tests to cover those changing objects from the transports. So from the beginning of the change in your development box in SAP, all the way through to testing out those changes so that you can be sure that you're getting into your production system with 0 defects.